a consistent plan that the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Indigenous Affairs in Ottawa can endorse and fund, with the support of the entire education constituency in this country, I think will take us ahead. And I guess my basic request is that you come up with that plan, in the details that are required.
Okay, I think that's a given, and we've been working on several plans, and I think the notion of being able to approach this on a regional basis has been more successful to us than trying to do a national process. Right now, our graduation rates are about 35%. Nationally, they're about 78%, and obviously we're trying to bring that up. Do you think that in this discussion we're going to have with respect to the plan that we have to go well beyond just talking about academics and the cultural part of our development into the social issues?
I don't think you have any choice. The social issues play a phenomenally important role in the fact that graduation level is down at 35%. Education is, the quality of education, the ability to do it is obviously important, but you're not going to get away. You cannot escape from the social problems that you have faced, and those are going to have to be dealt with. And by the way, a number of them are going to be brought into the school, are brought into the classroom, and more and more are going to be brought into the classroom. Most, as I understand it, and I think that it makes an enormous amount of sense. For instance, that there is a tremendous push to bring children in care back into the reserve, basically take that over, and I think that that's what should happen. But that means you're going to have children in care in the classrooms, on the reserves. If you have children in care in the reserves, then that's going to require a special understanding, and that the special understanding of how do you handle children in care. And so I think that what you're dealing with is an evolving thing. I think the other thing, Chief, in terms of the evolution of education, is that education is evolving everywhere. It's not just on reserve. Education is evolving everywhere. The new technologies are changing it. You're going to have to adjust to that, as every other educator is going to have to adjust to it. And what that really means is that we're all going to have to work together to make sure that that works.
How do we handle the social economic issues that we face in our communities? I mean, they're definitely tied to how our children perform. We've got housing issues. Sometimes we've got breakfast issues, food security, those kinds of issues. They all play a part in education. What would be your advice to the new Liberal government on this area?
I think that you're going to have to push and blow at the same time. I do believe that you have to deal with education, first of all, within an education context, because I know the way the government works, and that if what you try to do is deal with too many problems all at once, then you're not going to solve any of them. So I think what you've got to do is get very clear what it is you need in terms of education. Then having done that, then you've got to then marry that with the other problems, and you're going to have to deal with the health problems separately. You can't marry them, mix them with others. You're going to have to deal with each of them, and my worry is there's no doubt that education is a determinant of proper health care, that health care is a proper determinant of education. There's no doubt that they're all brought together. And I think that you're going to have to bring them together. But I do believe that when you're making the push on education, you've got to make it on education. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're just going to find yourself dealing 5 fights at once. And you ultimately fight the 5 fights separately and then bring them together. But I don't think you're going to get away with it, Chief, and you don't want to get away with it. Society is society. Society isn't any one single discipline, and we've got to solve them all, and they're all part of it.
One of the areas, I want to go back to funding for a bit. One of the areas that we've experienced in the past is that there's been this expression of being able to match provincial funding. So whatever the provincial school boards get, what would you advise the government with respect to that?
Well, I see Julia Candlish. I've talked to Julia Candlish about this a long time. I have, I understand I understand when you're fighting the fight. I actually have had a bit of a difference with people. I understand when you're fighting the fight, you got to fight. It's an easier fight to say we need equal funding with the provinces in the gap, but that's not enough. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you know, the average student, a non-Indigenous student, isn't the son or daughter of somebody who went to residential school. They're not somebody who fundamentally is living in communities where there's been, whether it's bad water, whether it's just been the huge social problems that have been in those communities. I think that ultimately, I think we'll get to where the funding can be equal between the First Nations and the other Canadians. But we got a lot of catch-up to play here. We got a lot to do, and I think that that's a start, but it sure as heck isn't a finish.
Okay, thank you. I guess you know that for us, I mean that's become a big issue for a lot of people, you know, the catch-up process. And I look at RCAP as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommending 1994-95 that, you know, we were going to talk about a 20-year front-end funding to be able to bring communities back up to par. So I would suggest that we're probably almost 40 years behind right now in the process. And so whatever we can do to move that yardstick is going to be essential.
Well, you know, I obviously have a preference. Let me just tell you what happened in the Kelowna Accord. And number of you here will remember that. But in the Kelowna, Carolyn certainly remembers that she was very much part of the process. When we sat down with the First Nations, I sat down with Phil Fontaine, who at that time was the Grand Chief. We basically said, this is the premiers and myself, we're not going to tell you what the problems are. You tell us what the problems are. We'll deal with your issues. And what they then did is they set out healthcare, welfare, education, economic development, clean water, and accountability. And we said, fine, those are the issues we'll talk about. Then we said to them, you tell us what the solutions are. We're not going to tell you what the solutions are. The solutions are but we will negotiate with you. We won't accept every solution. And that's what the tables were set up for. And the reason that it took 18 months is that the First Nations leaders, the Indigenous leaders, wanted to go back and consult with their people. But we came to it. It really depends on the nature of how you go. I think that we're not going to go back to the Kelowna Accord, but I think that the Kelowna process is the process that should be followed. That in fact, point of fact, the problems that should be addressed are the problems, first of all, that are raised by the First Nations. Second of all, the solutions are the solutions should be ones that are suggested by the First Nations. That doesn't mean every solution will be accepted, but it does mean that this has got to be done within your basis. You yourself have said it. The responsibility for education exists within the community. The community understands the community. These are where the parents are. The community understands what has to be done. The fact of the matter is that most of the stuff that the communities are going to want are stuff that is wanted by every single community across the country. And so we're going to have it. But let's come at it that way. I think that this idea that Ottawa knows, you know, my way or the highway, surely to God, after the last 10 years, we've learned that that doesn't work. So I think that the kind of process where essentially the first people that Carolyn Bennett should hear from, and that's why I mentioned in my remarks, is from the people in this room. And they're the people that have got to give her your plan.
Okay, one of my last questions then is that we're talking about funding. One of the big issues in our communities is that we spend an inordinate amount of time on administration and accountability in the process. And would you advise the government on how we might be able to look at this and make change with respect to that?
Well, Chief, I've never heard a community object to accountability. I've never heard a chief object to accountability. I think I think you have to have some measurement. I've never heard anybody object to it. Now, how it should be done has got to be done within the cultural context of the community that's being there. I did not realize that you think that this is a large cost in terms of how it's done.
Well, from where the perspective that I'm trying to bring to this discussion is that administration, you're right, first of all, nobody's opposed to accountability, but massive accountability is what I'm talking about, oversight, the amount of reports that have to be generated. I mean, we send in reports sometimes that are 300-400 pages long that I'm sure that nobody reads.
Yeah. Well, again, you know, I can tell you, I'm not sure the documents are still available. This was discussed extensively in Kelowna. The fact of the matter is that that the amount of reports that the communities have got to come up with are 2 feet thick, and they just pile up unread. Or if they are read, they probably got a little room there in Aboriginal affairs where people who just simply do is read them, and they don't have any, but they spend so much time reading the reports they can't do anything. I think that makes an enormous amount of sense. But what has to happen, and this again goes back to you, there should be essentially a group such as this, a much smaller group, that can basically cut the reports down to what is required. The reports that are should be required by Ottawa are no greater than the reports that should be required by every single member of the communities. And under those circumstances, I think both can be satisfied. I've had this time and time again. I've had chiefs come and say, let me just tell you something. When the former government walked away from Kelowna, I said to you that when we asked the chiefs, or we asked the First Nations, what is it should be dealt with at Kelowna? We asked them for 5 things. There was no surprise in the 5 things that they raised. But then they said there's a 6th. We want to deal with the issue of accountability. That surprised us. And they said, we want to deal with accountability. And they wanted to deal with accountability in 2 ways. One was transparency, and the other one was the point that you've just raised, and that is that we are asked to fill in these incredible number of reports that we don't think anybody reads, or if they do, they're going to have lost their sanity. And they said, we want to set up a table that is going to deal with this issue of the reports. When the Conservatives walked away from Kelowna, the chiefs who were on this table made a special request to the government to keep that table alive, and the Conservatives refused. My view is, basically, if you want to deal with that issue, and I think you're quite right to do so, basically restart, take the work that was done, they worked for 18 months, take the work that was done and build on it from there, and see what happens.
Okay, we'll find that work.
Okay.
Okay. Any last words that you want to provide to the delegates here today?
I actually, I wanted to be here. When I received the invitation, this is going to be an education symposium, I wanted to be here because I really didn't want to hear myself talk, but I really wanted to hear from the educators as to what is required. You're the people that really know, and I am so pleased to see the Minister of Indigenous Affairs here. And you know, you've got to say, think about it. I mean, I know the demands that are on her time, and if there's anything that indicates her interest in education, it is the fact that she is here. So all I want to do is to say thank you, Julie, and thank all of you for giving me this chance to be here. And thank you for this wonderful chair. I'm not leaving.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Grand Chief and Paul Martin, if you guys should just sit there for a few more minutes. We're going to take a couple questions. We want to try and end this by 10:45. We want to catch up with our time, make sure everything's going. So at this time, if anybody has any questions or comments, you can direct them either to Gord Peters or Paul Martin. Please come up to the microphones. Please state your name and your community. And we'll be taking a couple of questions. Thank you. Okay. And when you go to the mic, can you just turn the switch on?
All right, good morning. My name is Jason Thompson. I am a director on the North Superior Workforce Planning Board and a member of the Red Rock First Nation. And my question is, I guess for both members of the panel, is opportunity is a huge motivator. And I believe will assist in improving completion rates in regards to education for First Nation people. As a manager of a construction company and an entrepreneur, What does industry need to do, in your opinion, to get involved in the First Nation education systems to create that opportunity?
Well, I'm assuming that what your question really says is, look, we really need skilled people. How can we get them? The fact is that you've got to work with the schools. You have to work with the schools. There are technical schools across the board. I'll just give you one example, which Chief Peters would know, that, for instance, there's a technical school at the Six Nations Reserve. It's a very, very good school. A major Canadian company basically said, we're going to need 100 people a year, and they're going to have to be trained. So they're now talking to the Polytechnical School about, I set it up in order to sort of say, look, these are the skills that are required, the Polytechnic schools, can you deliver them? And what the private sector has to do is essentially take these people as they graduate. The real problem with the private sector is when the private sector comes in and you know that business goes up and down, all of a sudden, you know, you've asked for them when business was up here, and then all of a sudden they're delivered when business is down here, and then what you create is a huge problem. But I think that that's the kind of thing that you should work on. I think that essentially that what industry has to do is to work with the schools that are existing, and if there are not enough of those schools in the area in which you are, then I tell you, you can work with the federal department, with Carolyn Bennett's department to set them up, because this is the kind of thing that they should be doing.
Just to respond to you on I'll take a different twist on this. One of the things that occurs in our world is that women graduate at a far greater rate than men. And we lose a lot of our young men on a grade 10 level, 9 and 10 in that area. And thankfully we have the Aboriginal Institutes Consortium, because it helps men get back and helps other students get back into the professions that they wouldn't get back into. But we need to be able to figure out how to keep young men in school. We need to figure out how to keep young men motivated towards going to something. And if it's not the academic side, then it should be the vocational side, and looking at how we're going to get them apprenticing, getting into those areas. I think that's a huge part of what we need to look at as we move forward.
Big West, thank you very much. I guess I just want one last comment is, closing that gap, or creating those opportunities to get out to the communities, to the education boards in the local communities, and let them know there are opportunities out there, apprenticeship and so on and so forth. So I guess, I'm kind of tasking all the educators here today is, please look at that opportunity, because the trades are struggling. I'm hearing it from multiple different colleagues. They're looking at migrant workers as people that potentially fill that gap, but I think we need to look in our own backyard and move that forward. So.
But if you move into the school, if you move and work with the schools, I mean, it's not every industry has the capacity that the oil and gas industry had at the time. But if you ever go out to Fort McMurray, there's a Patrick McCurdy High School out there. There are two of them, the Composite High School. And what's happened, the industry moved right into the school to provide that kind of thing. And that'll provide a lot of the incentive that Chief Peters is talking about.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, next Mayor Foucault.
Bonjour. Patricia Big George, Chief of the Anishinaabe Nalgashi. I just had a question when you were talking about the MIA with the youth entrepreneurs. I think that there's a big gap. You give them the skills, you give them the training, whether they finish their high school. And the big thing that there's a big fall that I see is you give them the skills, then after the skills, they start their business, and there's no support for them to be able to achieve those contracts across Canada. We got to give them that support too.
Well, I think that's a good point. Dr. Carolina Lindblom is here. It's an interesting thing. Now that we've got 47 schools across the country, it's quite conceivable that we could build up some kind of a network of support. It's maybe it might well be the next stage in our entrepreneurship program. So we'll take it. Carolina's right there. So give her a heck.
Is there any more questions? I think we have time for one more. Okay, microphone.
Kolomosi, my name is Brent Stonefish. My title is about this long, so I usually just say everything education in Delaware Nation. So my question to you is, one of the things that we do in Delaware Nation is we're looking at a strategy for language. We have 2 fluent speakers left of the entire language across North America. So it's about making language and culture part of the foundation for education. And I know I've been watching the Paul Martin initiative over in Walpole and Kettle Point, and the focus you put on literacy and numeracy, which is great, and you're getting them up to the provincial standards. But the way that we're looking at things is that we want to create an education system that uses the Ontario standards as a minimum, meaning that culture and language is part of the foundation and that we excel our students. So my question is how is your initiative and how is the new government's dedication to making language a priority as opposed to 40 minutes per day at the provincial schools?
Well, again, Carolyn can obviously fill in, but the new government has made it very clear that they do understand the degree to which languages and culture are an essential part of education. They also understand the degree to which a person who is secure in their identity and a person who has the kind of cultural and linguistic background that you're talking about is going to be a far greater success in their academic efforts. And so I don't think there's any doubt about the desire of the government to help that. I think there's complete recognition of the need to fund it. Essentially, I think if you take a look at the way immersion courses have worked, and not everybody will agree with me, but fundamentally immersion courses have worked, that the more languages that you understand, if you're bilingual, if you've got 2 languages, then in fact your results would be far greater than if you only have 1. Your understanding, your capacity to look ahead, your capacity to intuit, your capacity to understand. So I don't think you have any difficulty making the argument that in fact that language training and cultural background will in fact lead to a better education, and that it's worthwhile putting the money into it. Now, how you're going to squeeze that 40 minutes into it, you know, and Carlin and I have discussed about this, and you can extend the school day, you can extend the school week, but even if you don't, I think I can't help but believe that you can work that in, and if you've got the will to do it, you've got to do it. And again, will the federal government cooperate with you? Yeah, they will if you lay the plan in front of them. I keep coming back to that. You've got to lay the plan in front of them. You've got to say, this is what we need, this is what we can do, and then people can test as to whether the result is working or not.
So what you're saying is Carolyn should pencil me in then?
Yeah. Well, at least you should give her a call.
I think one of the other commitments that we've seen is the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and really strong recommendations around language and culture coming out of that process. We've always fought for languages to be a part of any additional funding, but the last 10 years we've never seen anything that's come to real fruition out of that process. So I think one of the things that we have to be able to get from this process is not just in respect to the plan around the education, but a fund that's dedicated to language, because that language is not just dedicated on the community, it's our citizens wherever they reside.
Nishi.
Oh, thank you. I just want to thank Paul Martin and Gord Peters. At this time, we're not taking any further questions. We're going to move on to our next presentation. But if anybody has any outstanding questions, please see Julia. And thank you.